Chapter 18. Shannon versus the Reaper. Shannon and the Reaper clashed. As they traded blows, even when they didn't hit each other, their every action gave off soul. It rolled off of them, joining with the rest of the energy filling the clearing. The Reaper's ring of smoke fed upon that energy, refusing to dissipate, writhing in place and even expanding. Despite his injuries, which continued to heal before Shannon's eyes, even as he moved, the Reaper's movements were never impeded. He attacked in strange, jerking motions that seemed to erupt from his core without warning, making it hard to see any telegraphing movements. Shannon had to react to his attacks as they were already on their way, slowing down her defense. Shannon lashed out. She was faster than her opponent, but thanks to his smoke step, the Reaper could react quickly enough to avoid all but glancing strikes. Unlike Jo, who had honed her shadow step to enhance her offense, the Reaper had developed his step technique specifically to defend against opponents that he couldn't have kept up with otherwise, which made sense. It was the rogue hunter's job to outsurvive other outstanding foes. Meanwhile, though she tried to put it out of mind, Shannon was still shaken by the Reaper's invasion of her thoughts. Her opponent still carried one of his knives in his hand, and yet so far he had refrained from attacking with it, and as distracted as she was, Shannon had forgotten that it was there by the time he changed his tactics, swiveling the knife so that the blade protruded from between his fingers. Shannon saw the blade emerge, seeing a flash of light reflect off its edge out of the corner of her eye, but all that did was split her focus. She hesitated, and the knife cut into the flesh of her right shoulder, carrying upward in an arc, biting her cheek as well. Energy rolled off of it, burning her along its path. She could feel blood flowing from her wound, but ignored it. She had suffered far worse. Like her opponent, she continued as if she hadn't been injured at all. The Reaper turned a full 360 and thrust his blade right at Shannon's chest with one of his sudden jerking movements. Shaken or not, Shannon had the presence of mind to send soul into her arm and lash out with the fingers of her right hand, catching the blade between them. Shannon twisted her arm, diverting her opponent's blade away from her, but as she did, the Reaper took another knife from his pocket and thrust it at Shannon's neck. She raised her other hand, sending soul into it, a white light pooling in her palm, catching the blade and holding it back. Still, the tip of the blade came so close to her palm that her skin itched. The Reaper pushed, and Shannon sent more soul into her palm, pushing back, but it was just a little, too late. The Reaper surprised her when he let go of the first of his two blades and slammed the palm of his now free hand into the butt of the second. He drove it like a nail through the white barrier and through Shannon's hand behind it, lodging it there. Shannon gasped, but otherwise didn't acknowledge the injury. The Reaper smoke stepped back from Shannon just as she stepped back from him, and he reached toward her with his empty hands. More thick smoke poured from his sleeves and rolled toward the knives that Shannon now held, grabbing onto them like tendrils and snatching them away. Shannon gritted her teeth against the intense burst of pain that came with the removal of the knife from her flesh. The two knives flew back into the Reaper's hands, and Shannon watched while the tendrils of smoke reached out again, moving in wide arcs, latching onto each of the knives still floating where Shannon had ensnared them. The Reaper sent raw soul out along the tendrils and through his knives, shattering all of Shannon's little barriers, freeing up all 11 additional blades and drawing them back to him. He grabbed them out of the air so quickly that his arms seemed to be in 11 places at once, and he tossed all 13 knives up above his head. The knives clattered against each other in the air and scattered, but rather than fall back toward the clearing floor, they hung in the air, haloing their wielder. Immediately, they turned to point toward Shannon and surged toward her. She stepped back into a defensive stance and gestured 13 times with her ring and index fingers, her arm moving just as quickly as her opponent's had. Light flashed at 13 points along the ground. From each of them, following Shannon's gestures, another of her super-thin soul shears emerged, knocking all 13 of her opponent's blades out of the air mid-flight. Then the soul shears faded just in time for the Reaper to smoke step directly into Shannon's face. He brought 2 more knives from his pouch and renewed his assault, hoping to catch her while her attention was split. Shannon was finally beginning to calm down now, though, and while she had to admit that the Reaper was at least partially right, that she was out of practice, with each passing second she felt a little more of her old muscle memory return. Her opponent moved fast, smoke-stepping mid-attack so that he seemed to be thrusting his 2 knives at her from multiple directions at once, but Shannon was able to comfortably sidestep each of them. She didn't bother yet to attack back, waiting to reassert full control over her faculties. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, continuing to dodge just as effectively while she did so. And finally, she felt her heartbeat return to its controlled norm. Her eyes sprung back open, she stepped clear past her opponent's strikes, and she lashed out. Her strikes were simple and precise, utilizing her upper body, Quick, solid punches traded steps with powerful backhands that moved so fast that they stirred the air throughout the little woods. She hit the Reaper a dozen times before he realized what was happening, and a dozen more before he could do anything about it. The rogue hunter was forced to change his tactics. Returning to an earlier mode of thinking, he dedicated his smoke step purely to evasion, slipping out of Shannon's line of sight. Fortunately for Shannon, she had more than just her eyes at her disposal. More than her sixth sense, too. Having long since honed her fighting instincts to surpass them both, she felt for the subtlest changes in the flow of air around her, turned, and attacked the empty space to her right. At first, her fist hit only air, but then Shannon's opponent flickered into its path, so close that her knuckles tickled his face. It seemed that Shannon had gotten the best of him, that there was no time or chance left for him to escape, but then he became smoke again, and Shannon's fist sailed harmlessly through him. Shannon braced herself for her opponent to reform and counterattack, but that's when the Reaper sprung the trap that he'd set for her. The smoke that had been the Reaper's body twisted and spread out, surrounding Shannon, but before it had a chance to reform, the writhing smoke that still ringed the clearing, clinging to the ground like mist, rose up and formed a full dome around the two fighters, cutting off the light of the sun. It was only then that the Reaper struck. In the moment of confusion that accompanied the sudden darkness, Shannon felt two sharp and intense stabbing pains, one in her chest and one in her back. Then, as she reeled from the sudden impacts of the Reaper's knives, she was shaken by another 6 impacts, and then another 6, from multiple directions almost all at once, as her opponent smoke-stepped around her and rained down upon her with the rest of his weapons. Shannon dropped heavily, painfully, to her knees. The dirt beneath her was slick with a sticky substance that Shannon knew, even in her dazed state, was her own blood. She felt faint, but she managed to keep it together, to fight back control of her brain from the pain receptors lighting up all across her tattered form. It was something that she had too much experience with, as this still wasn't the worst that Shannon had ever experienced. She reached out with her sixth sense. Suddenly, she was aware of her opponent smoke-stepping into place ahead of her, several yards away, where he stood cautiously and waited. Apparently, Shannon had surprised the other fighter enough already that he suspected that she might do so again. Shannon felt her mouth fill with blood, and she spat it out, smiling, resolving not to disappoint him. With a calming breath, Shannon curled her fingers, digging desperately into the ground beneath her, displacing the blood that collected there ever thicker. "Life," she choked. "From the earth." Even as she spoke, Shannon felt a massive pool of warmth flow from beneath the ground and into the core of herself. Her pain subsided as her wounds mended from the inside out, her newly knit-together flesh pushing the 14 knives free to fall and splatter against the wet ground. Shannon stood up, a halo of golden light wrapping around her, lighting up the area within the dome of writhing smoke for a few short seconds before it flashed the same white as Shannon's own soul and faded away completely. Darkness fell over Shannon again like a veil, but this time she expected it. She was prepared. Her sixth sense still extended throughout the entire area, painting a clear picture in her mind of everything in the little clearing. Gusts of smoke surged forth from the Reaper's sleeves, just substantial enough to knock Shannon off balance should they hit her. She held her hands out in the path of the incoming smoke, and waves of white light spread out from her fingers, dissolving the smoke before it could reach her. The Reaper didn't hesitate. In the moment it took Shannon to conjure her barrier, he surged forward, more smoke pooling around his feet and carrying him smoothly over the ground. He twisted with vigor and thrust with all of his strength, slinging his right fist at Shannon's chest. She didn't react, and when his attack hit, there was a flash of white light at the point of impact. Shannon was pushed back, sliding across the ground, skidding to a stop several yards away, and yet she remained upright and completely unharmed. Undeterred, the Reaper smoke-stepped toward Shannon, and then away, and then smoke-stepped randomly around her, building momentum as Joe often did, before zipping right up behind her and driving a powerful, momentum-fueled kick into the back of her head. Shannon was sent flying forward, tripping, falling, and tumbling violently along the ground. She hit a tree, tore right through it, and hit another with enough force to splinter the trunk and knock it over, and yet another flash of white accompanied each impact. And Shannon stood up again a moment later, not even so much as bruised. Shannon turned slowly, unconcerned, to face her opponent again. He hung in the air, suspended upon a pillar of smoke, tendrils made of smoke spreading out into the air around him. Each tendril held one of the Reaper's bloody knives suspended within it. The tendrils swept back toward the Reaper, and he snatched his knives out of the air yet again. The pillar of smoke dissolved, and the Reaper dropped to the ground, immediately smoke-stepping away. He circled Shannon with his smoke step, moving faster and faster, faster than she'd ever seen him move before. and he threw the knives again, seemingly from 14 different directions at once. The knives were upon her in less than a second, but again, Shannon didn't so much as flinch. The knives hit, but again, light flashed from each impact point. The knives bounced away, making a noise as if they'd struck stone, and clattered to the ground around their would-be victim, who hadn't sustained as much as a new scratch. "What do you think?" Shannon, always the teacher, asked her opponent, speaking as nonchalantly as she could bear. "You really should feel honored. This is my ultimate technique, appropriately named Ultimate Defense. When I use life from the earth," she explained, "to heal and saturate my body with huge amounts of life energy, I use that life energy to generate more soul, and then mold that soul into a second skin made up of many layers packed so thin that they can't even be seen. The second skin distributes any damage I might take across its entire surface without allowing even the smallest amount to reach me inside. It takes a bit of focus to maintain, but it makes me virtually invulnerable as long as it lasts, and it has other uses too." As soon as the last words passed her lips, Shannon shot toward her opponent like a rocket. She threw a punch at his jaw with the strength of an out-of-control bullet train. The Reaper dissolved into smoke again to dodge, but Shannon's attack was so strong that his smoke was scattered in every direction. Force rolled off her knuckles, blasted a hole through the dome of darkness that still surrounded her, and reduced a row of nearby trees to sawdust. "The second skin also protects me from any strain or recoil damage," Shannon said as the smoke that was her opponent pulled itself back together rapidly, twisting into a person-sized pillar, then solidifying into the Reaper himself. "That means," she explained, "I can put everything I have into each and every attack without any chance of injuring myself. My power is effectively doubled." She flickered out of view, appearing at her opponent's side within the very same instant, even outstripping his smoke step technique. The Reaper smoke stepped away on instinct, turning to face his opponent. "I don't have to worry about overexerting my legs either," Shannon explained, "which doubles my speed, too. And I haven't even burned through a fifth of my reserves yet. You're strong, Soul Taker. I'll give you that. But no matter how you look at it, the simple fact is that you never stood a chance against me." The Reaper didn't say anything. In the darkness, even though she still couldn't see her opponent, Shannon could still sense that his body language spoke of resignation. His shoulders were slumped, his head hung, and he didn't seem eager to continue to fight at all. For a second or so, Shannon thought that she had actually managed to show her opponent the futility of his efforts, that she really would be able to send him on his way before taking things any further. It was a fleeting thought, though, because as quickly as that hesitation came over him, it disappeared. Shannon perceived the Reaper's muscles tensing up beneath his sweatshirt. She could feel his senses focusing on her again. Tangible, palpable tension filled the air, and sparks of energy jumped between the two fighters, signaling a renewal of hostilities. Even if he was reluctant to continue, there was no doubt that he was going to anyway, and that meant that Shannon didn't have any other choice left. One way or another, she would not allow the Reaper to keep threatening her family. "In that case," Shannon said, "I'm sorry, but it's about time I put an end to this." She gestured with her right ring and index fingers, and another long, thin, sharp, glassy white soul shear sprouted from the ground and surged toward her opponent's torso. He sensed it, and smoke stepped out of his path in time to save himself from all but a grazing wound, so Shannon gestured again and again, and again and again and again and again. Each time she did, another soul shear spawned into existence, intersecting the Reaper's most current location. Just like the first of the soul shears that Shannon had created, these were not the physically harmless default version that Wilson had told Joe about. Shannon was perfectly willing to end her opponent to save her children, and the shear sensed her intentions and adapted to them. Having already learned the hard way how dangerous Shannon's technique actually was, the Reaper took great pains to keep ahead of it. In fact, freed from the surprise of Shannon's initial attack, he was able to react more quickly, avoiding the subsequent attacks sooner. But after a dozen or so, he began to wear down. Meanwhile, Shannon, still saturated with life energy, didn't have to worry about her stamina failing her anytime soon. She just kept attacking until, finally, the Reaper was grazed again, and then pierced straight through the side. He stumbled, and Shannon moved in for the kill. She shifted her feet so subtly that the movement could barely be seen. She seemed to flicker, and she was at her opponent's side. Another soul shear flashed into existence beside her, and she snatched it up, despite its edge being more than sharp enough to cut her badly, protected by the invisible second skin of soul that surrounded her. She flickered again, turning so quickly that she appeared to be facing two directions at once, and she swung the soul shear with all of her strength, aiming right for the midpoint of the Reaper's torso. The Reaper was lucky. He was caught off guard by Shannon's finishing attack, but when his mind took too long to respond, his body reacted in its place, saving him. Just as the edge of the long, razor-thin blade touched the fibers of his sweatshirt, before it could slice all the way through them, the Reaper became smoke again. The blade passed through him without bisecting his body, but that didn't mean he wasn't still subject to its effects. Like before, the blade cut his metaphysical form so deeply that it injured the Reaper's physical body as well. Pain surged throughout his entire being, and he lost focus and reformed. Reacting to the pain more than anything else, he willed his soul and his life energy to mix. Energy exploded from him, pushing Shannon back. She turned to face him again, her soul shear held ready at her side as a sickly green aura that moved like wisps of smoke bellowed up around her opponent, lighting the dark with a ghostly quality. Shannon could feel her opponent's potential multiply at least 5 times over in an instant. Before Shannon could react, the Reaper was gone. He appeared again at her side, knives in hand, and began slicing at her wildly. The force of his blows was impressive. The Reaper still wasn't able to cut Shannon through her defense, but she was surprised to feel the energy fueling her technique dwindle noticeably with each impact. Begrudgingly, she actually raised her soul shear and used it to defend, wielding it like a staff or a spear. The two fighters clashed for a few moments, weapon to weapon. Shannon was impressed by how much her opponent's power had grown so suddenly. It seemed like more of a boost than he should have received, almost as if his near loss had inspired him to somehow get stronger in the process of fighting. Shannon actually had to fight to keep up with him, and missed several easy parries, taking more damage to her ultimate defense. Again, she felt the burden of her advancing age and her lack of recent experience. Pushing herself to the absolute limit, Shannon made note of her opponent's movements, anticipated how he would attack next, and moved to break his combo. Rather than defend with her soul shear, she turned into her opponent's attack, allowing her ultimate defense to deflect his knives wide, opening herself up to swing the shear and cut him deep across the chest. The Reaper saw the counter coming, and Smoke stepped away, raising his knives defensively to intercept the blow if need be, but Shannon had expected this. As the tip of her blade sailed harmlessly across the place where her opponent had just stood, she sent a wave of force along it. It slid off of the edge of the shear and exploded outward, pushing the two fighters apart to opposite sides of the clearing. Having bought herself a moment's reprieve, Shannon followed her opponent's example and willed her soul and her life energy to mix, generating so much new soul that it rose high into the air like a beacon, parting the smoke above the clearing, exposing the two fighters again to daylight. Shannon seized that new soul with the force of her will, shaping it, curling it back around her. Energy erupted from where Shannon stood, compressing the ground beneath her feet and uprooting nearby trees as her gleaming soul enveloped her, becoming a churning, intense, white aura that crackled yellow and blue all throughout. It had been so long since Shannon had had to use this much of her power that the sensation of the aura enveloping her was almost surprising. Shannon's aura multiplied her potential by roughly another 9 or 10 times on top of the power granted by her ultimate defense. Her intention was to use all of that extra speed and strength to overwhelm her opponent and finish him before he could even react, and yet she never could have guessed that it was this exact moment that the Reaper had been waiting for. Shannon felt a wave of relief roll off of him, confusing her, but her confusion was immediately forgotten, replaced with fear so intense that it was like a cold hand gripping her heart, born from one single familiar word. "Mom?" Shannon's gaze fluttered left toward the sound of her daughter's voice. She grew disoriented, as she had when looking into the Reaper's eyes, but she still watched as Joe stepped into view, passing completely through the wall of smoke that surrounded her. Time seemed to slow down. Joe, confusion spread across her face, met her mother's eyes. She was too fixed upon Shannon to notice when the Reaper emerged from the smoke as well, just behind her. And Shannon was too shocked by what she was seeing to react as the Reaper brought his knife around in front of Joe and drew it in one swift motion across her throat. Shannon screamed. She screamed like she had never screamed before. She dropped heavily to her knees, wailing, tears pouring from her eyes almost as fast as the blood from her daughter's neck. She met Joe's eyes, searching desperately for any spark of life within them, but she found nothing. Soul rolled off of Shannon in waves, splitting the ground in every direction, and her energies continued to climb. She hadn't yet allowed her soul and her life energy to separate again before Joe had appeared, and seeing what she had seen, she bore down on those energies reflexively, forcing them together even further. Her aura collapsed and her ultimate defense shattered, falling away from her like glass as her soul grew so great that Shannon, in her shocked state, wasn't able to control it any longer. Her soul folded back on her. She was swept up in it, feeling as if every cell in her body was about to explode. And then the soul was gone, rolling off of her like a shockwave. She felt suddenly and completely drained, like she had run a marathon every day for a week. She no longer felt the presence of soul within her. She had just enough presence of mind left to know that she had burned out, She was cut off from her soul for at least the next several days, as helpless as Joe had been in her last moments. As Joe's lifeless body fell prone upon the ground, Shannon collapsed likewise. She never took her gaze away from her daughters, even as her wailing turned to quiet sobs. She had failed to protect Joe as completely as was possible, and now she didn't even have the strength left to get revenge for what had happened. Without her soul, Shannon was powerless in the face of the Reaper, who she could hear approaching. That, however, was Shannon's first indication that something was wrong. The realization came slowly through the fog of her grief, but it did come. She could hear the Reaper's footsteps clearly, so how was it, then, that he wasn't moving? She could still see him plain as day, standing, unmoving, beside Joe's body. She didn't even have time to be confused before the Reaper that she could see seemed to grow fuzzy, as if he were going out of focus. Then, suddenly, he melted into smoke and writhed and twisted back into the wall of smoke that still ringed the clearing. Meanwhile, the footsteps continued to grow closer, even as Joe likewise grew fuzzy and likewise dissolved into smoke, and Shannon realized what had happened. So weakened and so stunned that most people in her state might have passed out from shock, Shannon found the strength to turn herself over and push herself halfway into a sit. She turned red, puffy eyes to look into the void that was the face of her opponent. She remembered when she had met his gaze, and it had felt like he could see everything that she was afraid of. "You could see," Shannon told him, trying her best not to sound as utterly defeated as she felt, "how afraid I am of losing my girls, and you projected that fear on your wall of smoke. You waited until I was powering up, counting on my power flying out of control and turning back on me." "I didn't have a choice," the Reaper replied, and Shannon was surprised to hear what sounded like remorse upon his tongue. He even sounded like he was justifying himself as he continued. "I saw all of your fears. I saw your fear of losing Joe and Sarah, and I saw how afraid you are of my organization in general. You know so much about them, and you're convinced that they're looking for you too. I don't know who you actually are," he asserted, "and I don't actually care, but it's painfully obvious now that I was never going to beat you with my power alone. But I still need you for my plan. That left me with no choice but to turn your own power against you. I showed you the fear that I thought most likely to do that." "So Joe's still alive?" Shannon half-asked, half-asserted, her voice quivering with desperation. "She is," the Reaper confirmed, and Shannon was flooded with relief, the likes of which she had never felt before. She no longer cared that she'd lost. She no longer cared that her opponent planned to use her as bait, or that he had seen her full power and survived. Those were certainly things worth being concerned about, but in that moment, all that mattered was that Joe was okay. And so there was still a chance that she would stay that way, even if just for a little while longer. "Do what you have to do," she told the Reaper, "but don't think that taking me means you've won. It doesn't matter what you think. My girls are stronger than you can imagine. They'll find a way to stop you one way or another." "We'll see," the Reaper replied as he shed his ghastly aura and struck Shannon in the side of the head with a lightning-quick, yet restrained, knife-hand strike. Her eyes glassed over as she lost consciousness. It was less than another 10 minutes before Joe emerged from the front doors of the Mega Dojo, her match having finally ended. Her teammates had remained behind to change into less sweaty clothes after their hard-fought victory, something that Joe had intended to do as well until she noticed that Shannon wasn't anywhere to be seen. That reminded Joe that she hadn't seen her mom in the crowd watching the match, either, which was just confusing enough to be worrying. The exterior of the Mega Dojo being the last place that Joe had seen Shannon, that was the first place that Joe thought to look for her. As soon as Joe set foot outside of the building, she got the impression that something was wrong. Without even having to scan the lot for it, her eyes fell upon her mom's sand-colored sedan. Even from so far away, she could see that while there was no one inside or standing near it, there was something stuck beneath one of the wipers, fluttering in the wind. Joe felt as if she were separated from her body, looking upon the world but unable to affect it. The scores of other people leaving the Mega Dojo behind her, parting around her on their way to their own vehicles, were white noise to her. They were immaterial and didn't matter. Without even having to check, Joe knew what the piece of paper would say. She snapped back to reality and made the trip across the parking lot in an instant with a single shadow step. Her hand shaking, she pulled the paper from its perch and examined it. It was a ragged piece of scrap paper from an old flyer with some disjointed type in the corner. But that wasn't what drew Joe's eye. Instead, her gaze was drawn to the 3 simple lines of written text in the center of the fragment, transcribed in black marker. "I have your mom. Come to the construction site near the mall tonight with our mutual friends, or she'll die." Joe felt the color drain from her face. The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Joe knew exactly who had left it. The Reaper had her mom. He had taken her while Joe was busy, too distracted to do anything about it. Joe looked up across the main street that went past the mall complex. There, looming over the entire area, was the construction site in question. There had once been plans to build a large, multiple-story hotel complex there, but an employee strike had halted development for almost a year. Now it was nothing more than the incomplete frames of 2 grand buildings reaching half as high into the sky as they were meant to. Joe's eyes fell upon those metal skeletons, and she felt herself start to seethe. Any fear or apprehension about the coming conflict with the Reaper faded, and before she could even feel it coming, soul erupted from her, breaking the asphalt at her feet and pushing her mother's car away. The Reaper had gone too far this time. Hurting Joe was one thing, but hurting her family was another. She'd meet with him, but it wouldn't be on his terms. No matter how strong he was or how badly he'd beaten her in the past, Joe would make him regret his actions.